Picture this: 1972, a small theater somewhere in the American heartland. A film is playing that cost less than $90,000 to make, and suddenly, panic erupts in the audience. People are screaming, someone is vomiting, someone else is running in hysterics toward the exit, and one viewer, if the legends are to be believed, tried to break into the projection booth to physically destroy the film reel. This isn't a tabloid tall tale. This is the real audience reaction to a film that today is considered one of the most important in horror history. And the wildest part? It was directed by a man who had previously taught humanities at a university and by temperament, resembled a quiet professor more than the king of bloody cinema. Hello, you're watching Just Sneak, and today we're breaking down the story of the film that changed our understanding of what screen horror could be. Wes Craven's directorial debut, The Last House on the Left. If you enjoy uncovering real scandals, intrigues, and human dramas behind the glossy facade of the film industry, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our next deep dives. And now, let's get down to business. Let's start with the fact that this film shouldn't even have existed in the form we know it. The idea didn't come from a desire to scare audiences for entertainment, but from a far darker source. Wes Craven and producer Sean Cunningham, the same man who would later give the world Friday the 13th, took their cue from Ingmar Bergman's Swedish film The Virgin Spring, an adaptation of a medieval ballad about violation and revenge. Only instead of a subtle Scandinavian drama about losing faith in God, they decided to make something raw, naturalistic, and utterly uncompromising. The first version of the script was called Night of Vengeance. And believe me, it was far more brutal and explicitly pornographic than what ultimately made it to theaters. Filming began using that rough, maximally harsh draft. And only during the process did Craven start cutting the most unbearable episodes, because even the crew couldn't stomach what was happening in front of the camera. Now imagine who would even agree to star in this madness. The cast was assembled literally through acquaintances and chance encounters, and that in itself has its own scandalous twist. For the lead villain role of Krug Stillo, they cast David Hess, a man who at the time was better known not as an actor, but as a musician and songwriter, and he actually wrote the film's score, including that haunting ballad that plays on screen. And haunting ballad creates a completely unnatural contrast with the violence unfolding. The actress for Sadie, the gang's female accomplice, was originally sought among performers much older, but ultimately the role went to 21-year-old Jeremy Rain, who at the time of casting was playing Susan Atkins, a member of the Manson family, in an off-Broadway production about the infamous case. So the actress literally moved from playing a real killer from a cult sect to playing a fictional but no less brutal criminal. And that's hardly a coincidence of the era's spirit. And the actor for Fred Weasel, Krug's partner, was found among people with experience in pornographic films. Fred Lincoln came to the project from that world. And that's another detail that perfectly explains why the crew wasn't afraid to shoot it. Such explicit and visceral material. What you get is a team both behind and in front of the camera, where the line between art house exploitation cinema and semi-underground culture was practically erased. The budget was laughable even by early 70s standards. The crew consisted of friends, acquaintances, and people who agreed to work for almost nothing, just to be part of something new. The house where the Collingwood family scenes were shot actually belonged to Sean Cunningham's parents. The costumes were made by his own wife, Susan Cunningham. Literally, the entire film was held together by the connections of one small group of enthusiasts who had no studio support, no serious money, and no plan B. This was true guerrilla filmmaking, shot on pure enthusiasm and the belief that audiences were ready to see real brutality, not Hollywood convention. Cunningham himself later described the shoot with the word guerrilla, and that's no exaggeration. The crew shot in real houses, real forests, without permits, without proper logistics, often changing the shooting plan on the fly because the pre-written schedule simply collapsed under the weight of technical problems and lack of funds. The same person could work as a camera assistant in the morning, carry equipment in the afternoon, and participate in editing in the evening. Craven, in addition to directing, also edited the film himself, an almost extreme overload for a debutant. And it was precisely because of the lack of money for expensive special effects that the team was forced to rely on maximum practical realism. No prop work for beauty's sake, only what actually works in front of the camera and provokes a viscerally, rather than aesthetic reaction in the viewer. Paradoxically, it was the poverty of the budget that became the film's main artistic device. And here we come to the figure without whom this story simply wouldn't exist. Wes Craven himself. And believe me, his biography shatters every stereotype about horror directors. He grew up in a strict Baptist family where dancing, movies, and any secular entertainment were forbidden. Young Wes received a humanities education and taught English and philosophy at a university. Imagine a university professor who suddenly decides to make one of the most shocking films of the decade. This isn't a story about a street rebel. It's about an intellectual who deliberately chose to blow up the film industry from within, using exploitation cinema as a tool for social critique. Formally, The Last House on the Left was made as a reaction to television coverage of the Vietnam War, which flowed into American homes every evening right during dinner. Craven wanted to show audiences violence without embellishment, without romanticization, without gloss, violence that makes you physically nauseous, the way real cruelty should make you feel. That's why many critics later interpreted the film not as an endorsement of violence, but as a harsh anti-war and anti-establishment statement. And this is a fundamental difference from Bergman's Source. There, the tragedy happens because of apostasy from God. Here, it happens because state institutions, the police, the law, order, prove powerless and useless precisely when they are needed most. Subscribe to Just Sneak if you want to see more of these deep dives where genre cinema hides a real social bomb. And we continue digging deeper, because the real behind-the-scenes chaos is just beginning. The shoot turned into a real ordeal for everyone involved. The actors, many of whom were completely inexperienced, filmed scenes of violence so intense that it left psychological scars for years to come. The lead actress, Sandra Cassell, later admitted that the shoot was immensely stressful, and the atmosphere on set became almost unbearable at times due to the realism of what was happening. The actors playing the maniacs, primarily David Hess as Krug, immersed themselves so deeply in their roles that the line between acting and genuine brutality literally blurred. The crew specifically concocted a recipe for fake blood using a mixture of blue and red food coloring with caramel syrup to achieve the most realistic, viscous, and repulsive effect on screen. And it worked so well that distributors in Germany later tried to sell the film as actual footage of a murder, literally as a snuff movie. Think about that. Marketers seriously considered passing off a fictional film as documentary evidence of a real killing, just to attract audiences. What's telling is that critics of the time split into two irreconcilable camps, and that divide itself became part of the scandal. The influential Chicago Sun-Times reviewer Roger Ebert, surprisingly to many, defended the film, calling it a tough and mean little picture that turned out far better than one would expect from such a low-budget affair. For a critic who rarely favored the horror genre, this was almost sensational. But the New York Times reviewer Howard Thompson took the exact opposite stance, calling the film nauseating hackwork and bluntly advising readers not to waste their money on this repulsive spectacle. So you have a unique situation. One of America's most authoritative film critics defends the film as an honest statement, while another equally authoritative critic from the country's leading newspaper publicly calls for ignoring the film as unworthy garbage. This professional schism fueled ordinary viewers' curiosity almost more than the rumors of fainting in theaters. A separate drama unfolded around the rating. When Craven first submitted the edited version to the MPAA, the American Ratings Board, the film received an X rating, effectively equating it to pornography and banning it from wide release. Craven and Cunningham frantically began cutting the most shocking segments, resubmitting the film for review over and over, but the rating remained unacceptable. And then, according to those involved in the production, something almost comically audacious happened. All the cut scenes were restored, and the team essentially got the R rating through a connection, someone who had access to the ratings board's paperwork. So the film with the most extreme content of its time went into release with a rating it formally shouldn't have had. This wasn't just a production trick. It was a real scam at the industry level that people were reluctant to discuss for decades. If you enjoy this format, cinematic investigations with a touch of scandal, don't forget to ring the bell on the Just Sneak channel, so you don't miss the next deep dive. And by the way, drop a comment about whether you'd heard this rating story before. I'm genuinely curious how many people know these details. Now, briefly about the plot without major spoilers, because the story itself is more of a pretext than the film's main value. A young girl, Marie, and her friend Phyllis head to the city for a rock concert to celebrate her 17th birthday. On the way, they carelessly get involved with a gang of escaped criminals, and then begins a nightmare of violence and humiliation. But the real plot twist comes later. The criminals, fleeing the police, end up seeking shelter at the home of one of the victims' parents, completely unaware of who they're dealing with. And then the film transforms from a story about victims into a story about revenge. Revenge so wild and primal that the viewer starts asking an uncomfortable question. Are those parents who take the law into their own hands really the judges? It's a subtle, almost philosophical shift in moral orientation, and it's what makes the film far deeper than simple B-movie exploitation. The key theme here is the collapse of the illusion of safety. The parents are initially presented as model, caring, reasonable people from a comfortable suburb, and it's precisely they, placed in extreme circumstances, who demonstrate that civilization is a thin veneer beneath which lies an equally beastly capacity for cruelty as the criminals. This resonates with real social sentiments of the early 70s. Trust in state institutions was crumbling, the Vietnam War was broadcast live, and the countercultural ideals of the 60s were beginning to crack. The film captured the spirit of the times more accurately than many far more expensive productions. When the film finally hit theaters, a national scandal erupted. Test screenings in individual cities were so commercially successful that distribution gradually expanded to new cities, along with the famous advertising slogan, "To avoid fainting, keep repeating, it's only a movie." Agree. That phrasing was both a provocation and a warning, and the public's reaction fully justified those expectations. Cases were documented where viewers became physically ill in the theater, and some cinemas received complaints demanding an immediate halt to screenings. Theater owners and managers sometimes cut scenes themselves from the prints they received, simply because they couldn't bear showing such material to their own audiences. Ultimately, less material survives today than was originally shot. Some frames with the most explicit scenes were physically destroyed. The film was burned, and part of the audio track was irretrievably lost. Then came the international wave of scandal. In the UK, the film was denied a distribution certificate in the mid-70s, and a decade later, during the famous moral panic around so-called video nasties, films deemed too violent for cassette distribution. The Last House on the Left, Was, officially placed on the banned list. The fully uncensored version only received official permission for screening in Britain in 2008, meaning the film was effectively banned for over 30 consecutive years. A similar fate befell the film in several other countries, where it was periodically either banned or returned to release in truncated forms. In Germany, as we mentioned, distributors tried to sell the film as real murder footage, which predictably provoked an even harsher reaction from German censorship authorities. The film was kept under lock and key there for years, with only heavily cut versions released. In Australia and several other Commonwealth countries, the film also periodically appeared on banned lists, with censorship agencies using virtually identical wording. Too realistic, too violent, too similar to documentary footage. The irony is that this very indistinguishability of fictional violence from the real thing was Craven's primary goal. And it was also the main reason for decades of bans worldwide. It's a vicious cycle. The more convincingly the director executed his creative vision, the more aggressively state institutions tried to hide the film from their own citizens. Speaking of money, despite the scandal, or rather largely because of it, the film proved phenomenally profitable. On a budget of around $90,000, the film eventually grossed over $2 million at the box office, and by some estimates, including re-releases in different territories, the final take was even higher. That's fantastic profitability even by big Hollywood standards, let alone independent B-movies. Distribution was handled by Hallmark Releasing and American International Pictures, which quickly realized that the film's scandalous reputation wasn't a problem but free advertising, and they actively exploited this notoriety in marketing campaign, only fueling public interest in the most shocking film of the year. Essentially, the louder demands to ban the film, the more people wanted to see it for themselves. The classic forbidden fruit effect, which worked even without conscious calculation by the creators. If you've made it this far, thank you for your attention. And if you're not already subscribed to Just Sneak, now's the perfect time to fix that, because it gets even more interesting. We'll talk about who betrayed whom on set and why Craven himself was ashamed of this film for years. Now for the truly dirty details, the reason you're probably still here. The atmosphere on set was extremely tense. The small budget meant the actors and crew worked literally to exhaustion, often without proper conditions or rest, and the scenes of brutality were shot so realistically that some participants later admitted they felt traumatized by the filming process itself, not just the result on screen. David Hess, who played the main antagonist, recalled that immersing himself in the role of the maniac was so psychologically draining that he couldn't fully shake the state for a long time after shooting. This created friction within the group. Some actors felt uncomfortable around those who immersed themselves too deeply in violent characters, and conflicts periodically flared up on set precisely over this issue. A separate scandalous thread involves Craven himself and his attitude toward his own film in subsequent years. After the barrage of criticism, accusations of promoting violence, and outright disgust from part of the press, the director admitted he was genuinely shocked by society's reaction. He expected audiences to grasp the anti-war and anti-establishment subtext, but instead a significant portion of the public and critics perceived the film as reveling in violence for its own sake, almost as an endorsement of rape and murder. This was a serious personal blow to Craven, an intellectual who wanted to make a statement about the brutality of modern society suddenly found himself at the center of accusations of creating violence pornography. For years afterward, he visibly hesitated to discuss the film in interviews, acknowledging that in some ways, it indeed pushed the boundaries of what was acceptable far more than it should have. The scandal also hit Craven's commercial prospects as a director. Despite the box office success, the film grossed many times its $90,000 budget. The reputation of a man who made too violent a film scared off investors who might have supported more serious, non-commercial projects. In effect, the scandalous fame locked him into the horror genre for years to come. Producers were only willing to invest in new horrors, not drama or anything more personal. That's how, partly by necessity, Craven's next cult project was born. The Hills Have Eyes. Here's the paradox. The scandal that nearly buried the director's career ultimately built it, just not in the direction he originally dreamed of. Drop a comment, by the way. What do you think? Can this level of screen brutality be justified by social commentary, or is it just a convenient cover for exploitation cinema? I'm genuinely curious to read your opinions. Feel free to argue with each other in the comments below this video. As for expert assessment of the film today, over half a century later, critical opinion remains divided, and that's probably the main reason the film remains cult, rather than just a forgotten artifact of the 70s. On one hand, many film scholars acknowledge that from a formal craft perspective, the film looks rough in places, uneven editing, inconsistent acting, cinematography far from ideal. It's a low-budget debut without studio polish, and it shows in every frame. On the other hand, it's precisely this rawness, this almost documentary roughness of the image, that works for the film more powerfully than any gloss could. Viewers believe in what's happening precisely because it's shot not as a Hollywood attraction, but as if accidentally observed reality. Another point that still baffles researchers is the film's strange tonal schizophrenia. Alongside scenes of extreme, almost unbearable brutality, there are overtly comedic episodes featuring two bumbling provincial policemen, trying to find the criminals and constantly ending up in absurd situations. Many viewers and critics have never forgiven Craven for this jarring contrast. Immediately after a scene of brutal violence against the heroines, the screen shifts to almost vaudevillian farce, and these emotional whiplashes feel to some audiences like a slap in the face, destroying any sense of narrative unity. Other researchers, however, see this tonal rupture as a deliberate device, a way to show how absurd and helpless official institutions of order look against the backdrop of true, unvarnished evil they simply can't handle. Either way, this controversial editing and dramaturgical choice has remained one of the main points of contention around the film for decades, with no definitive answer as to whether it was a brilliant directorial stroke or a rookie's amateurish error. In terms of industry influence, the film's significance is hard to overstate. The Last House on the Left largely laid the foundation for an entire horror subgenre. Rape and revenge, stories of vengeance for sexual violence, which dozens of other directors would later develop. The film showed that low-budget horror could generate serious box office and simultaneously provoke a public debate of such magnitude that serious publications would write about it, not just the tabloids. This opened the door to a whole generation of independent horror filmmakers who understood. You don't need a huge budget to truly scare an audience. You just need the courage to push an idea to its limit. Critics and film historians still debate where exactly the line lies between honest artistic expression and sheer exploitation of sexual violence for box office returns. And this isn't an idle question. Within the next decade, riding the wave of Last House on the Left's success, a flood of similar films hit screens with the same formula: violence, then revenge by the victim or their loved ones. Some of these films genuinely tried to develop the social and psychological dimension Craven established, while others simply copied the shocking form without any substance, turning the device into a cheap attraction. That's why The Last House on the Left's place in film history is dual. On one hand, it's the intellectual origin of an entire movement. On the other, it's the unwitting instigator of dozens of far more cynical and meaninglessly brutal imitations that only reinforce the subgenre's reputation as something shameful and lowbrow. The evolution of the film's reception over time deserves separate attention. What was perceived as obscene provocation unworthy of being called art in the 70s became a subject of serious academic analysis decades later. Film scholars write articles about how the film reflects the trauma of post-Vietnam America, how it deconstructs the myth of the cozy suburb, and how it destabilizes the very idea of just retribution. The film that people tried to physically destroy, burning copies, cutting pieces, keeping it locked away for years in various countries, became an object of study in university courses on horror history. This is a rare example of how scandal doesn't kill a work, but instead preserves interest in it for decades to come. If you're not already subscribed to Just Sneak, now's a great time to fix that, because we release these deep dives regularly, and the next scandal might be even louder than this one. At the same time, the film largely failed as pure entertainment in the conventional sense. It offers the viewer neither catharsis nor moral satisfaction in the finale, nor a sense of justice. The revenge scene, which by genre conventions should bring relief, instead creates even more unease because it shows how easily ordinary people descend to the level of those they punish. That's why part of the audience never accepted the film. It refuses to provide simple emotional answers where viewers expect them. Years later, the film received official recognition in the form of a 2009 remake that Craven himself produced. This is perhaps the best proof that scandalous notoriety transformed over time into classic status. What people tried to literally burn and ban worldwide in the 70s, studios deemed valuable enough 30+ years later to invest in a full-scale remake with a proper budget. If you enjoy how we dissect cult films and extract not just the plot but the real behind-the-scenes dramas, definitely subscribe to Just Sneak, like this video, and share it with friends who love diving into film history scandals as much as you do. In conclusion, The Last House on the Left isn't just a low-budget 70s horror that happened to make noise. It's a cultural phenomenon born at the intersection of an intellectual director's personal drama, guerrilla production without money or connections, an era of public distrust in government, and a censorship system that didn't know how to respond to such material. The film managed to simultaneously offend a huge segment of the audience and become the cornerstone of an entire subgenre. It destroyed Craven's reputation in the eyes of conservative critics, and simultaneously built him a career that would later give the world Freddy Krueger and the Scream franchise. It was burned, banned, cut by censorship worldwide, and still survived to see an official remake and classic status. And if you think about it, the entire history of this film is a perfect illustration of how unpredictably cultural memory works. None of the creators in 1972 set out to make a classic for the ages. A team of enthusiasts with a shoestring budget was just trying to survive the harsh conditions of independent filmmaking and say something honest about the violence that streamed daily from Vietnam onto American television screens. But it was precisely that honesty, that desperate rawness, that allowed the film to outlive its creators and dozens of more successful, expensive, and technically polished films from the same decade that almost no one remembers today. These are the stories that show real scandals in the film industry are rarely accidental. Usually behind them lies a clash of ambitions, fear, a shoestring budget, and a desperate desire to say something truly honest, even if society isn't ready for it. What do you think? Does the film's artistic and social value justify the degree of brutality it shows on screen? Share your opinion in the comments below this video. Discuss it with other viewers. I'm genuinely curious which side will prove more convincing. It's interesting to see how the fates of those involved in this scandal turned out. David Hess, who played one of the most frightening villains in horror history, remained a sought-after musician until the end of his life, and occasionally returned to acting in similar genre projects, though the role of Krug still haunted him in the public eye for decades. Many viewers genuinely couldn't separate the actor from the character and treated him warily even at personal meetings. Sandra Cassell, who played the victim at the center of the scandal, quickly stepped away from acting, and in interviews years later admitted the shoot left a heavy emotional scar she had to deal with in her adult life. Sean Cunningham, the producer of this venture, used the experience and connections he gained to later build his own horror franchise, Friday the 13th, which far surpassed Craven's modest debut in commercial success, but never matched its depth of social commentary. As for Craven himself, the irony of fate is that the film for which he was called a pervert and accused of promoting violence became studied in film schools years later as an example of honest, uncompromising authorial expression within genre cinema. In the 80s, Craven would create Freddy Krueger, a character who also began as a metaphor for real violence hidden behind the mask of a supernatural monster. And in the 90s, he would make the Scream franchise, which reinvented the slasher for a new generation of viewers. In each of these later, far more technically polished and commercially successful projects, it's easy to trace a direct line back to The Last House on the Left, to that rough, cheap, scandalous debut made by a former university professor on money, barely enough to buy film stock. Perhaps the main lesson of this story is that genuine cult status is rarely earned by films that everyone liked from the start. Far more often, cinema history remembers the films that split the audience in half, that people tried to ban, burn, and erase from history, and they, despite everything, survived and remained in cultural memory decades longer than far more successful and critically acclaimed projects from the same period. The Last House on the Left is a textbook example of just such a fate. A film that was literally wanted dead ended up outliving its detractors and becoming part of the canon. That's all for today. If you enjoyed this deep dive, subscribe to Just Sneak, hit like, and see you in the next video, where we'll break down another cinema story whose behind-the-scenes drama you probably never suspect.